Today, Visa announced something that will be remembered, if not understood correctly right now, as one of the most consequential financial developments of the current decade. The company that processes more payment transactions than any other entity on earth announced a new platform to provide stable coin services to more than 200 million merchants worldwide. The press release used words like innovation, expansion, digital payment solutions. The financial media covered it as a fintech story. Here is what it actually is. Visa just built the infrastructure to settle 200 million merchant relationships without touching the US dollar, not as a pilot program, not as a niche product for crypto enthusiasts, as a core service offering to the merchants that constitute the backbone of global retail commerce. The dollar's most loyal institutional servant just announced that its merchants don't need the dollar anymore. History has seen this before, not with Visa, not with stable coins, but with the specific dynamic of a reserve currency being bypassed not by its enemies but by its own infrastructure. And the historical record of what follows is one of the most important and least discussed chapters in monetary history. Before examining the historical parallels, it's worth being precise about what Visa's stablecoin platform actually does, because the technical details matter for understanding its monetary significance. A stablecoin is a digital asset designed to maintain a stable value relative to a reference currency or asset. The most widely used stablecoins, USDT, USDC, and several others, are pegged to the US dollar. One stablecoin equals $1 in value. They are backed by dollar reserves held by their issuers, and they are designed to function as digital dollars for transactions on blockchain networks. On the surface, this sounds like a dollar extension rather than a dollar bypass. If the stablecoin is pegged to the dollar and backed by dollars, isn't it just a digital form of the same currency? The answer is not quite, and the distinction is crucial for understanding the monetary history implications. When a merchant accepts payment in USDC, a dollar-pegged stablecoin, the transaction does not flow through the US banking system, through the Federal Reserve's payment infrastructure, or through the SWIFT network. It flows through a blockchain. The dollar peg means the value is anchored to the dollar, but the settlement infrastructure is entirely separate from the dollar system. This distinction may seem technical. It has profound monetary consequences. The dollar's reserve currency status rests on two pillars: the dollar as a unit of account, the currency in which prices are set, contracts are written, and value is measured, and the dollar as a settlement medium, the currency in which transactions are actually cleared and finalized through US-controlled financial infrastructure. These two pillars have always been assumed to go together. The historical record shows they don't have to. And the history of reserve currency transitions shows that the settlement pillar, control of the infrastructure through which transactions actually clear, is the more fundamental one. Once settlement migrates away from the dominant currency's infrastructure, the unit of account pillar eventually follows. Visa's stablecoin platform, at its current stage, maintains the dollar as a unit of account while beginning to migrate settlement away from dollar-controlled infrastructure. This is precisely the early stage dynamic that monetary history identifies as the beginning of infrastructure bypass. The most ancient and most instructive precedent for internal currency bypass is the late Roman Empire's experience with its own monetary system, a case where the citizens of the dominant empire themselves created the alternatives to the currency their government was debasing. The Roman denarius, the silver coin that had served as the foundation of the imperial monetary system for centuries, began its long debasement in the 3rd century AD. Faced with the enormous fiscal pressures of frontier wars, civil conflicts, and imperial administration, Roman emperors progressively reduced the silver content of the denarius from roughly 90% silver in the early empire to approximately 2% by the 260s AD. Each reduction was individually small. The cumulative effect was the destruction of the coin's intrinsic value. The response of Roman citizens, merchants, and the institutions was not primarily political protest or military revolt. It was bypass. The people who needed to conduct commerce, who needed to store value, exchange goods, and enter into contracts simply stopped relying on the debased denarius for those functions and found alternatives. The most common alternative was barter, direct exchange of goods and services without any monetary medium. But barter is inefficient at scale, and Roman commerce was too complex to function purely on barter. More sophisticated was the emergence of commodity money, payments in grain, olive oil, wine, metals, and other physical goods whose intrinsic value was independent of imperial monetary policy. The Roman state itself contributed to this bypass inadvertently. As the denarius lost value, the imperial government increasingly collected taxes and paid its soldiers in kind in physical goods rather than coins. Because the coins were no longer reliable stores of value, the state was bypassing its own currency. The monetary historians who have studied this period note something crucial. The denarius was not abolished, it continued to circulate. Imperial edicts continued to set prices in denarii. The former monetary architecture remained intact. But the real economy, the transactions that actually mattered for commerce, for storage of value, for the actual exchange of goods and services, had migrated away from the denarius long before it was formally abandoned. The parallel to Visa's stablecoin platform is not that stablecoins are equivalent to late Roman barter. It is that the pattern of bypass of commercial infrastructure moving away from the official monetary medium before that medium is formally replaced is the same. Visa is not replacing the dollar formally. It is building the infrastructure through which 200 million merchant relationships can function without touching dollar settlement. The dollar may continue as a unit of account. The settlement infrastructure is beginning to migrate. To understand why Visa's stablecoin announcement is historically significant rather than merely technically interesting, it's necessary to be precise about what stablecoins are and what Visa is actually building. A stablecoin is a digital asset whose value is pegged to a reference currency, most commonly the US dollar. The most widely used stablecoins, USDT, Tether, and USDC, Circle, each maintain a one-to-one peg to the dollar, backed by dollar-denominated reserves held by their issuers. When you hold USDT, you hold a digital token that is supposed to be worth exactly $1 and redeemable for $1. This sounds like simply another form of dollars, a digital representation of the same currency, no different in monetary terms from a bank deposit or a money market fund share. And at the individual transaction level, that assessment is roughly correct. A merchant who receives payment in USDC and immediately converts it to dollars has simply received dollars in a slightly unusual format. But the institutional infrastructure through which stablecoin transactions flow is fundamentally different from the institutional infrastructure through which dollar bank transfers flow, and those differences are precisely where the bypass potential lies. A conventional dollar transaction between two parties in different countries flows through a correspondent banking network, a chain of banks that each hold accounts at other banks, passing the transaction along until it reaches its destination, with each bank in the chain taking a fee, applying its own compliance checks, and operating under the regulatory jurisdiction of its home country. This chain is slow. International transfers can take days. It is expensive, fees accumulate at each correspondent bank, and it is subject to American regulatory jurisdiction at multiple points because most correspondent banking chains pass through at least one American bank or use dollar clearing facilities that are subject to American law. A stablecoin transaction between two parties flows through a blockchain network, a distributed ledger that records the transaction without any intermediary bank. Settlement is near instantaneous, fees are minimal, and the transaction does not pass through any American bank or American regulatory jurisdiction unless the parties choose to convert their stablecoins back to dollars through a regulated exchange. This is the bypass. Not a different currency, the stablecoins are denominated in dollars, but a different institutional infrastructure that routes the transaction outside the correspondent banking network, outside American regulatory jurisdiction, and outside the fee structures that have made conventional international dollar transfers expensive. Visa's announcement takes this bypass from the margin of the financial system, where stablecoins have been used primarily by cryptocurrency enthusiasts and specific international payment corridors, to the institutional core of global commerce. 200 million merchants is not a niche, it is the backbone of the global retail economy. The most important historical parallel to understand about Visa's stablecoin move is not primarily about payment efficiency or cost reduction. It is about regulatory jurisdiction, about the specific American control mechanisms that the stablecoin infrastructure routes around. This is where the euro-dollar parallel is most precise. The euro-dollar market's primary attraction was not that it was better money, it was that it was dollar money outside American regulatory jurisdiction. The freedom from regulation, Q interest rate ceilings, the freedom from American bank examinations, the freedom from American withholding taxes on interest payments. The freedom from the political risk that the US government might freeze assets held in American institutions, the risk that Soviet banks had identified in the 1950s and that was confirmed 65 years later in the 2023 Russian reserve freeze. Stablecoin infrastructure provides an analogous set of regulatory freedoms. Stablecoin transactions do not pass through the SWIFT messaging network, the network that the US and EU weaponized against Russia and Iran, as documented in the fifth video of this series. They do not pass through correspondent banking chains subject to American anti-money laundering and sanctions compliance requirements. They do not create a paper trail in American regulated financial institutions that makes dollar flows visible to American regulatory and intelligence agencies. For the countries, institutions, and individuals who absorb the lesson of the 2020 Russian reserve freeze, that dollar assets held in American regulated institutions were political instruments rather than neutral financial assets, stablecoin infrastructure offers something genuinely valuable: dollar-denominated transactions routed through infrastructure that is significantly harder for American regulators to monitor, freeze, or weaponize. This is not a theoretical concern. The practical consequences of this regulatory bypass are already visible in specific use cases. Countries under American sanctions have used stablecoin networks to conduct international transactions that would be blocked through conventional banking channels. Businesses in countries with fragile banking systems have used stablecoins to access dollar-denominated savings and payment services outside their domestic banking systems. And the general principle that stablecoin infrastructure provides dollar-denominated financial services with reduced American regulatory exposure has been understood and acted on by a growing range of users for years. Visa's announcement scales this dynamic to 200 million merchants. Note, because Visa is trying to help sanctioned countries evade American controls, Visa operates under American regulatory. The historical record on what happens after institutional bypass infrastructure is built and scaled is specific and consistent enough to extract clear patterns. The first stage is adoption by early movers with the highest incentive to use the bypass. In the euro-dollar case, this was Soviet institutions avoiding American asset freeze risk and European banks seeking regulatory arbitrage on interest rate ceilings. In the current stablecoin case, this is businesses in high inflation economies seeking dollar-denominated stability without access to conventional banking, businesses in sanctioned economies seeking payment infrastructure outside American regulatory reach, and international merchants seeking lower-cost cross-border payment settlement. The second stage is adoption by the mainstream as the efficiency advantages of the bypass become visible and the risk of using it seems manageable. In the euro-dollar case, this was a wave of European and Asian banks that entered the euro-dollar market in the 1960s as its efficiency advantages became clear and its regulatory risks seemed contained. In the current stablecoin case, Visa's announcement is the beginning of this stage, the moment when a mainstream, regulated, trusted institution signals that stablecoin infrastructure is ready for general commercial adoption. The third stage is scaling that outpaces the regulator's ability to control. The euro-dollar market grew faster than American regulators could develop the frameworks to monitor and control it. By the time the Federal Reserve and the Bank for International Settlements had developed serious regulatory frameworks for euro-dollar banking, the market had grown to a size where any attempt to fully regulate it back inside American jurisdictional control would have been prohibitively disruptive to the global financial system. The fourth stage is structural embedding, the point at which the bypass infrastructure has become so integral to the functioning of global commerce that the currency it was originally bypassing finds itself structurally dependent on the bypass infrastructure rather than the reverse. Stablecoin infrastructure is currently between the second and third stages of this sequence. Visa's announcement accelerates the transition from Stage 2 to Stage 3 by providing the mainstream institutional infrastructure that enables mass commercial adoption. The timeline from here to Stage 4 depends on adoption rates, regulatory responses, and the competitive dynamics between different stablecoin platforms. The most counterintuitive aspect of the stablecoin bypass, and the one that most financial commentary misses, is the paradox at its core. Stablecoins are dollar-denominated. Visa's stablecoin platform settles in dollar-pegged instruments. So in what sense is this a bypass of the dollar rather than simply a new delivery mechanism for the same underlying currency? The answer lies in understanding what the dollar's reserve currency status actually means structurally, not just the currency itself, but the institutional infrastructure through which it flows. The dollar's reserve currency status confers several distinct advantages on the United States, all of which flow through specific institutional channels. The ability to monitor and control international financial flows through the correspondent banking system and SWIFT. The ability to freeze assets and impose financial sanctions flows through American banks' custody of foreign assets and American control of clearing infrastructure. The seigniorage revenue from global dollar demand, the benefit of issuing the currency that everyone needs to hold, flows partly from the fact that global dollar demand requires holding dollar-denominated assets in dollar-denominated financial institutions. When dollar transactions are routed through stablecoin infrastructure rather than conventional banking channels, these advantages erode, even though the currency being used remains nominally dollar-pegged. The monitoring advantage erodes because stablecoin transactions on public blockchains are pseudonymous and not routed through American regulated financial intermediaries. The sanctions weapon erodes because stablecoin infrastructure does not pass through the choke points, correspondent banks, SWIFT messaging, American clearing houses where sanctions are applied. The seigniorage advantage is partially preserved because stablecoin issuers hold dollar-denominated reserves, but it is partially eroded because the reserve holding requirement moves from American banks to stablecoin issuers whose regulatory and jurisdictional relationships are more complex. This is the dollar paradox of stablecoin bypass. Transactions remain denominated in dollars, but the institutional infrastructure through which they flow and through which American monetary and geopolitical power is exercised is bypassed. The currency remains. The power that flows. Placing Visa's stablecoin announcement within the framework this series has built across 16 videos produces a specific and important analytical conclusion. The reserve currency transition this series has documented has been driven across most of its chapters by external actors reducing their dollar dependence, central banks buying gold, BRICS nations building alternative payment infrastructure, China reducing treasury holdings, Gulf states exploring yuan oil settlement. These are external pressures on dollar dominance, the equivalent of rival trading networks competing with Amsterdam's Gilder infrastructure or American financial markets competing with London sterling infrastructure. Visa's announcement introduces a fundamentally different and historically more consequential category of pressure: internal institutional bypass. The institutions built on dollar infrastructure, the payment networks, the commercial banks, the financial intermediaries, beginning to build and deploy infrastructure that routes around the dollar's institutional control mechanisms. This is historically the more decisive development. External competitors provide alternatives. Internal bypass providers remove the need to even choose an alternative. They make the bypass the default path for the most common transactions in the global economy. The euro-dollar market's development in the 1960s was the last major example of this internal bypass dynamic. It took decades for its full consequences to become apparent, consequences that are still playing out in the complex relationship between offshore dollar markets and American monetary sovereignty. The stablecoin bypass may develop more quickly given the speed of digital infrastructure adoption relative to the gradual institutional evolution of the euro-dollar era. The convergence of external dollarization pressure documented across the previous 15 videos of this series with internal institutional bypass, announced today by Visa, is the monetary history equivalent of a front closing from both directions simultaneously. The external pressure reduces demand for dollars in international settlement. The internal bypass reduces the institutional infrastructure through which American monetary and geopolitical power flows, even for transactions that remain nominally dollar-denominated. For investors and ordinary people trying to understand what the Visa announcement means for their financial decisions, the historical record of institutional bypass eras produces specific observations. The first observation is that bypass eras benefit early adopters of the bypass infrastructure disproportionately. The merchants, businesses, and individuals who integrated euro-dollar banking earliest in the 1960s captured the efficiency advantages, higher deposit rates, lower borrowing costs, more flexible transaction structures that the growing market provided. As the market scaled and arbitrage opportunities narrowed, later adopters captured fewer advantages. The same dynamic is likely to apply to stablecoin infrastructure. The efficiency advantages are largest when adoption is still partial and the old infrastructure is still dominant, creating price differentials that early movers can capture. The second observation is that bypass eras create regulatory uncertainty that benefits flexible, internationally diversified actors over those concentrated in heavily regulated jurisdictions. The Eurodollar era created significant advantages for banks and financial actors operating in less regulated offshore centers over those operating exclusively within American regulatory frameworks. Stablecoin bypass infrastructure is likely to create similar advantages for actors in jurisdictions with clearer, more permissive stablecoin regulatory frameworks, a competitive dynamic that is already reshaping financial infrastructure location decisions. The third observation is that bypass eras tend to accelerate the de facto erosion of the bypass currency's institutional power faster than its nominal reserve status changes. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency throughout the euro-dollar era and continues to hold that status today. But American monetary sovereignty over global dollar flows was meaningfully reduced by the euro-dollar market's development. Stablecoin bypass will likely produce a similar bifurcation. The dollar's nominal reserve status may persist long after its institutional control mechanisms have been substantially eroded. The fourth observation is the most important for long-term wealth preservation. The historical record on institutional bypass eras consistently shows that the assets that preserve value best are those that maintain intrinsic worth, independent of which institutional infrastructure is dominant. Gold, which requires no institutional infrastructure to hold its value, which has survived every institutional bypass in the past 5 centuries without losing its monetary role, is precisely this kind of asset. The central bank gold buying documented in this series is, among other things, a hedge against exactly the kind of institutional bypass that Visa announced today. 200 million merchants. One announcement. The largest payment network in the world, building infrastructure that routes dollar transactions outside the institutional channels through which American monetary and geopolitical power flows. This is not a cryptocurrency story. It is not a fintech story. It is the story of the Dutch merchant who first settled a transaction in London bills of exchange instead of Amsterdam, Gilder instruments, who made a rational, profit-motivated decision that multiplied across millions of similar decisions by millions of similar actors, contributed to the transfer of financial primacy from Amsterdam to London over the following century. It is the story of the Soviet bank that first moved its dollar deposits to London in the late 1950s, creating the seed of the euro-dollar market that would grow to reshape the relationship between American monetary sovereignty and global dollar flows over the following decades. And it is the story of what this series has been documenting from its first video, a reserve currency transition that is being driven not by a single dramatic event, but by the accumulation of individually rational, profit-motivated decisions by millions of actors who are collectively building the infrastructure of the next monetary order. Visa's announcement is one data point, one chapter, one more piece of the pattern. Subscribe, because this channel reads the pattern, not just the headlines.